Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, it is Poetry Thursday, a fun day to talk about some of the poetry that has interested me and maybe even inspired me in my own poetry writing. Today I want to talk about a poem that uses the word trans a lot. I would describe the synopsis or a little bit about what makes it weird, but it's really hard to do that, and I think I'll talk a little bit more about that in the analysis section. But the poem is My Melissa by T.C. Tolbert, which was published in 2020. For those who don't know, T.C. Tolbert is an American poet who lives in Arizona. That's important because they were the poet laureate of Tucson for like 2 different years. I don't think they were consecutive years, which is a bit interesting. Tolbert is also trans, and I should note that I might use the pronouns he, him, and his for Tolbert, and that's because those are Tolbert's preferred pronouns. But Tolbert also prefers she, her, hers pronouns, at least according to their website. So I'm a bit unclear on the exact, nature of their trans identity. That's probably none of my business, but it makes it hard to fully address them or refer to them when talking about their poetry, but shouldn't be a big deal. And this is, again, part of my efforts to highlight LGBTQA poets on this channel, not just during the month of June, but during a period of Pride, which I have designated from the month of May until the end of July, because that's always fun. And of course, I'll always talk about poets outside of this period because it's important to talk about the LGBTQA community year-round because they are human beings just as well as everyone else. So Tolbert is a very interesting poet. I would say their poetry is about identity, about spirituality, maybe not. I think you could make that argument, and indeed I will later in this video. And it's a bit about like their trans identity and maybe the very nature of being or something like that. Their poetry is hard to parse sometimes, and again that'll pop up later. But without further ado, let's talk about My Melissa. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. My Melissa. Whose trans body is a house without a hacksaw, a nap inside a needle, a glass vase 3/4 full of smooth stones, whose trans aorta is a mesquite tree careening through power lines, a Cooper's hawk lit by lightning, whose trans lungs are 2 jars full of bumblebees singing on the uncovered back porch. Even our name is a match tossed into the fire it started, an edgeless invocation. Melissa, a wind made by swinging, grass cutting through concrete, bubble wrap being danced on, albeit slowly, as if that alone could quiet the tiny explosions down the hall, whose trans-articular cartilage is string light threaded through the rafters, whose trans-tunica media is a silver of decorated cardboard doubling as a protest sign inside the window, which only serves to emphasize the window's inefficacy against the sun, whose trans-epiglottis is an apron on a hook, whose trans-trapezius are cups in the sink filled with inconsistently directed knives and spoons, whose trans metatarsals are green beans boiling on the stove, whose trans subclavian artery is organ pipe cactus under cloud cover, whose trans left ventricle is a black-capped goldfinch hanging upside down to eat, whose trans lesser trochanter is a hen's claw growing around a rope, whose trans great saphenous veins are technologies of prediction, tarot, storm tracker, political polls, whose trans dead space is the undeniable pollution of light, whose trans thyroid cartilage is commissioned graffiti, whose trans facial hair is the gentrifier yelling gentrification, whose trans erythrocytes are dapples of daylight drug across a concrete block wall, whose trans stroke volume is a live stream filibuster, whose trans plasma is the intimacy of strangers immediate in an emergency, whose trans plasma proteins are women filling a courtroom, one by one approaching the judge, performing all the mental and physical labor of attaining a divorce, whose trans integumentary system is the myth of meritocracy, whose trans rectum is a local philanthropic institution, whose trans bile is the taste of a slap echoing in your mother's open palm, whose trans femoral vein is a cat's claw crafted search for the sun, whose trans pharynx is an empty building brimming with trampolines, whose trans ovaries are interrobangs used unironically, whose trans ureter is a stop sign stuffed with bullet holes near a ditch filled with sunflowers near a wasp nest near a farm. Sometimes I am afraid of me, my trans sympathetic nervous system, my trans fatigue cracks, my trans 1 Corinthians 3:16 training the God right out of my trans temple. All trans dove, no savior, a trans baptism, holy to be a fire trans trembling in the tear of the trans daughter trans tongue. How I love you now, my trans vagina, my trans manubrium, my trans Melissa, in every iteration. T.C. Melissa Dawn Tolbert, who was once a Harrison, a wife to a husband. It is possible she loved me then too. Hiding, can she hear me say thank you to my trans uterus, my trans pectoralis major, my trans penis. The highest point on earth is in the ocean. Sea stars, our bodies becoming a trans prayer, an infinite, inexhaustible rhizome of the heart. You, whose tragus is trans, whose kidneys, whose medulla oblongata, whose adrenal glands, whose cochlea, whose pleural space, whose trans sacrum is simultaneous the site of the storm and the keel of a storm-scored boat, whose trans erector pili muscle is the fact that no matter when this sentence is read, it will be true that someone somewhere is trying to survive a sexual assault, whose trans inferior vena cava is a clock that has not yet been hung on the wall. I love you, time, how trans you are, your trans boredom, ribbon sharp and meadow bold, you, whose bark is trans, whose recovery, whose lumen, whose partial pressure trans, in order to live, must continue to respond to changes in the lungs. And so that was My Melissa by T.C. Tolbert. In terms of analysis, that was a pretty long poem, and what a doozy of a poem it is. In terms of trying to figure out the narrative, it doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be a narrative. It seems, again, as I was saying before at the start of this poem, a lot of what T.C. Tolbert writes is spiritual, or it's about identity, but she writes it in a way that doesn't really follow a narrative. Like, it doesn't have a set of things that they're writing about. T.C. Tolbert seems to be writing about themselves or about another person. Like, they talk about this person named Melissa in this poem, who like might have been their wife. They say in the tear of the trans daughter trans tongue. And so is Melissa their family member, a trans family member? Their wife is their daughter? Whoever Melissa is important to T.C. Tolbert. And even then, Melissa might just be Tolbert themselves, because as the narrator says, like, my trans Melissa in every iteration, T.C. Melissa Dawn Tolbert, who was once even a Harrison. And I don't know much about Tolbert's past, but I do know that they're trans. They identify that way. And for them to say T.C. Melissa Dawn Tolbert, is that who they are? Is that their true identity? Like, some people, like, they go by one name before they go through a transition and by another name afterwards, or even like before they transition at all, they make a name change. So is Melissa their real identity, and T.C. Tolbert is simply their dead name? That might be the case, but based on their website, they still go by T.C. Tolbert. So who is to say? But what is important is this feels like a sort of spiritual recognizing of their identity by going through every facet of their being or of this other person's being, and recognizing every single part of their selves internally and externally. Sorry, they end up like identifying what their being is. Like they say, whose trans body is a house without a hacksaw, or whose trans tunica medica is a sliver of decorated cardboard doubling as a protest. And it's really interesting how they choose to define this body, because a lot of it is not positive. Like a lot of it is like, oh, it's a sign inside of a window, a protest sign inside a window, which only seems to emphasize the window's inefficacy against the sun. Or whose trans epiglottis is an apron on a hook. Or even they describe one thing as like the gentrifier yelling gentrification, something like that, which I find to be one of the more interesting parts of the poem. And so maybe this trans identity is, it's filled with both good things and bad things. I don't know 100% like what it's supposed to mean, but if I only talked about poems that I understood on this channel, we wouldn't talk about very many poems. So I feel like there's a lot that you can pull from this and try to decipher as you're reading this poem, and I encourage you all to do that out there by reading it and trying to figure it out. But ultimately, I do think it's very embracing of the trans identity. And the other thing about it is that Tolbert uses the word trans so often that it really becomes meaningless as you go through this poem. And I think that's the goal here. Like if you say a word enough, like hamburger, 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 eventually it starts to lose its meaning. And a lot of people put a lot of meaning on the word trans, especially those people who would seek to oppress the trans community. So if you say the word trans enough, if you make trans seem normal enough or even boring enough, people will eventually just move on from that and focus on other things. And it won't be so special that you're trans anymore, which is good, because trans people are human beings and you shouldn't just make one group of people seem more special than the other. And so by you're really helping to normalize the trans identity by saying it so much. I think that's another aspect of this poem that Tolbert's trying to get at. Anyway, those are my thoughts on My Melissa by T.C. Tolbert, a poem with a lot to think about, pretty long poem, and I'm not even sure that, in talking about it, I've really grasped everything that there is to grasp about it. Like each time I read it over the past week or two, I've come to see more about it and view it from different perspectives. And I feel like my next read through will be much of the same, something new to discover in reading the poem, which I feel is really should be the goal of all poetry, is to get something new from it each time you read it. So yeah, if you read this before or you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about T.C. Tolbert. Their poems are really wonderful. And I really want to get other people to be aware of the poems, and also so we can get Poetry Thursday going around on BookTube. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and trans body part travels. Farewell.